Good morning, Maing Buntag. So I'm the first presenter, no, and also a first-time presenter. This is Baptism by Fire. Okay, so in front of you is my study, Stitching the Island Creative Heritage and Environmental Memory in Caohagan's Quilting Tradition. Has anyone been to Caohagan Island or have tried island hopping tours around Cebu? So if you're from outside Cebu, you can definitely try it. And then I encourage you to visit Caohagan Island. And it's really part of the tour package. So, okay, so before I dive into the research, I'd like to present to you what Caohagan Island is and where is it located. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is Caohagan Island. Welcome to the island. And this is the island where the sea shapes daily life, where fishing remains central to survival. At first glance, on the left side of your screen is or the right side, is the quilt from Caohagan Island. At first glance, these quilts appear decorative. They are often described as handicrafts, souvenirs, or livelihood products. So today I will share how the quilting tradition of Caohagan Island functions as a form of creative heritage through which environmental experiences, ecological knowledge, and community memory are stitched into the material form of a quilt. So next, just stay in the slide, sorry. So it is in this tiny speck of land, about an hour's boat ride from mainland Cebu, and we are talking about just 650 residents. It's a community entirely dependent on basically two things, the rainfall and the marine resources surrounding them, which means their relationship to that specific environment as well. It's a matter of daily survival for them. How did a highly structured, very traditional Japanese quilting technique arrive on this tiny Philippine island? So that's a question. A Japanese publisher named Katsuhiko Sakiyama actually purchased the island. He was captivated by the environment, the local way of life, and his wife Junko happened to be a renowned quilt educator back in Japan. She brought this highly formalized art form to the island as a supplementary livelihood project. The idea was to give the women an extra source of income alongside their fishing and shellcraft. But it seems like the islanders were initially very hesitant about it, about the whole thing. Because it's a tedious hobby. And it was very disconnected from the reality in the island. A local woman in the name of Clara stepped up, learned the craft, finished a few quilts, and sold them to Junko. That was the turning point. So other women on the island saw the potential and became interested. But here's the other interesting part. So the quilting, the art form they developed, was not a carbon copy of the Japanese techniques that Junko taught. You have precise drafting, rigid templates, meticulous measurements. Every corner has to meet perfectly. But the quilters, the Caohagan quilters, look at these rules and just completely threw them out the window. They started cutting cloth freely, relied on their intuition by just arranging shapes on the floor of their homes. It's such a fundamental shift in methodology. So that's the entire story, in a nutshell, of Caohagan quilters. In the next slide, so what do the quilts carry? Most existing accounts describe the Caohagan quilts in three ways, as handicrafts, tourism products, livelihood interventions. But those narratives are very important. However, they leave another question largely unexplored. What knowledge might be embedded within the quilts themselves? Do these textiles encode ecological knowledge and environmental memory? How do the quilters understand the meanings of their work? And what aspects of the quilts become visible or invisible through institutional representations? So these are the questions that shape this study. In the next slide, to explore these questions, I employed a qualitative, interpretive research design. The study combined four methods. That's first, the ethnographic observation conducted on the island. Second, the semi-structured interviews with the active quilters. Currently, there are 30 active quilters. When it started in 1990s, there were 100, and now there are a little bit about 30. Third, visual compositional analysis of the quilts themselves. And lastly, a discourse analysis of institutional and public representations of the quilt tradition. So if you have not encountered the Caohagan quilts in any of exhibitions, I will be presenting them those in the next slide. Rather than treating the quilts simply as objects, the approach allowed me to understand them as cultural text and creative practices embedded within everyday life. So these are the 5 intersecting lenses I used for this study. Cultural ecology helped me explain how communities adopt and create meaning through their environments. TEK, or the traditional ecological knowledge, provided a way for me to understand the ecological knowledge that emerges through lived experience rather than formal scientific experience. Memory studies help me frame how experiences persist through material forms. Material culture encouraged me to treat objects not as passive artifacts, but as carriers of stories and meaning. Finally, the critical heritage studies ask an important question: whose knowledge becomes visible through heritage practices, and whose knowledge remains overlooked? Together, these lenses allowed me to examine the quilts as both cultural objects and ecological texts. For the first finding, next slide, one of the strongest findings I have or emerge is that many explain that they do not begin with sketches or templates. So the quilters told me that. Instead, they begin with their huna-huna, or their memory, their observations. They think about the island. They remember fish they have seen, birds that pass through, coconut trees, houses, and scenes from everyday life. What appears in the quilts is therefore not simply island-inspired art. It is rooted in observation. Even the production process itself remains environmentally embedded. For example, quilts are washed in seawater and later rinsed in collected rainwater before drying under the sun, just to check if the colors would die out. The environment is present not only in the imagery but also in the making of these quilts. That intimate, prolonged familiarity is what drives the quilters' art. They're translating their daily reality into a fabric, and because that daily reality is so intertwined with the island and the sea, the quilts become these astonishing, vibrant mirrors of the island's ecology. The next finding is concerning memory. Quilting transforms fleeting experiences into this durable material form. A fish may be caught, a shoreline may change, a reef may degrade, or a landscape may be altered, yet these experiences continue to exist through the quilt. In this sense, the quilts function as more than just representations. They become repositories of their memory. They preserve ecological understandings that can continue to circulate even as environmental and social conditions change. The quilt therefore acts as a bridge between the past experience and the future remembrance. The third finding concerns knowledge. The ecological imagery found in the quilts is not random. Across different quilters working independently, I observe recurring depictions of similar fish species, marine organisms, and coastal elements. These consistencies suggest shared ecological observation rather than individual artistic invention. So as you can see, they don't follow a pattern. They don't follow any textile. They actually depend on the textile design, for example. As you can see here, in the lower bottom, there's the fish red fin, and then they use actually a different textile there. This is what we call the traditional ecological knowledge that has been studied through oral traditions, farming systems, and fishing practices. However, this study suggests that ecological knowledge can also be expressed through creative material practices. In other words, knowledge is not only spoken, sometimes it is stitched. The fourth finding emerged from examining institutional representations of the quilting tradition. So these are the exhibitions where the Caohagan quilts have been exhibited. Several recurring narratives appeared. The quilts were framed as livelihood success stories. They are presented through paradise imagery. They were celebrated for their aesthetic appeal. They often occupied an ambiguous space between craft and art. None of these narratives are inaccurate. However, they rarely foreground ecological knowledge as a central dimension of the quilts. Taken together, these findings suggest that the Caohagan quilt functions as an informal archive. It simultaneously serves as ecological memory, cultural transmission, and creative heritage practice. Where this research points next, this research also opens several directions for future study. Because quilting is practiced primarily by women, the tradition offers a valuable lens through which to examine gender and ecological knowledge, how this domestic creative labor contribute to environmental stewardship, how do women become custodians of ecological memory. Further research could also examine earlier generations of quilts and compare this tradition with other quilting traditions across Southeast Asia. I would like to end this with thought. When we look at the Caohagan quilt, we often see color, craftsmanship, and beauty, but we may also be looking at something more. We may be looking at an archive of environmental experience, a record of how people observe, remember, and relate to the world around them. Recognizing creative heritage not only as a source of livelihood or cultural pride, but also as a source of ecological knowledge, opens new possibilities for community-based environmental education, participatory governance, and culturally grounded resilience. In a time of rapid environmental change, these forms of local knowledge matter, and sometimes they survive not in reports, maps, or databases, or even researches, but in cloth, thread, and memory. I would like to acknowledge the women quilters of Caohagan Island whose stories, creativity, and generosity made this research possible. Thank you so much. And if you like to purchase your own quilt, just check out those pages.